Welcome to Social Studies Samurai. In this video, we'll talk about how to formulate a research question and justify its relevance. So let's get started. Okay, so this is how to write a research question and justify its relevance. What does that mean? We'll talk about in a moment. So in the video, we will talk about why this process is important. We'll talk about the MYP individuals and societies criteria attached to what we're going to do, and the approaches to learning that are also attached to what we're going to do, and of course how to formulate a good research question, also called an RQ, as well as how to justify the research question, meaning why it's good, important, significant, that kind of thing. But first, let's talk about what a research question is. It sounds simple, but really, a good research question is clear, it's focused, and it's debatable. And it's also complex. A good question has many different parts to it. So if you want to have a good question, it's got to be complex. And we'll talk about how to do that. So let's review the kinds of questions we engage with when we do an investigation. We have factual questions, conceptual questions, and debatable questions. For our purpose right now, we're looking at debatable questions. And these questions should allow us to take concepts and facts as well as ideas and have a debate on a topic or an issue or something, that is heated. It must have multiple perspectives. It must have varying arguments, right? If we have that, then we can synthesize and analyze and justify a position that we, determine based on our evidence. And this, basically should allow for discussion to happen. And debate and discussion, they can be positive, not always like in your face negative. The one thing that's important is that your question should not have one answer. If there is one answer that everybody agrees with, it's not debatable, right? So for MYP individuals and societies, we are looking at criterion B for what we're doing here today. And basically it is formulates a clear and focused research question, thoroughly justifying its relevance with appropriate evidence. Right, what does that mean? Basically, it means that you create a good question that is easy for someone to understand, know what you're going to investigate or write about. It's very focused on something specific, and that you can say why it's important, why this needs to be looked at a little bit more. And we'll get into how to do that in the video. So for the ATLs, approaches to learning, we are looking at the skill category of thinking and critical thinking, and more specifically analyzing and evaluating issues and ideas where you will find formulating debatable questions. That's what we're doing today. A good research question is important because it helps you avoid writing an essay that just has a list of facts or a list of points or a list of ideas or opinions. It's going to help you. A good research question will help you develop a specific and debatable thesis. It's also going to help you do deeper analysis and in the end, help you come up with a reasoned conclusion or a reasoned argument. Essentially, we're looking at a higher focus, which means we're not vague, we're not too broad, and we have a lot more depth into what we're doing. And as a reminder, your thesis is basically the argument or the claim that you're going to try to prove. And it should be in the first paragraph of an essay, near the end, if not at the end, and in the introduction of whatever kind of product you're creating. It's got to be near the beginning. Now, a good research question is important because it's going to give you a starting point so you don't go into too many different directions, which helps with your planning so that you know what you're going to do and when you're going to do it. It also guides the scope and the nature of your research, giving you more control over the whole process. And the scope being the people, the events, the time period, the place, and the disciplines that you're going to be using or looking at in your investigation. Is it economic? Is it political? Is it historic? Is it social, cultural, that kind of thing? And the nature would be, is it analytical? Is it comparative? Are you looking at varying perspectives, perhaps? The kinds of sources you might use? These things will come naturally from a good research question. Another important reason for a good research question is that it guides your methodology, the way you do your research. So for example, you might take more of a qualitative approach, looking at patterns and trends and themes and the impacts of events, cause and effect, and that kind of thing. But you might take a quantitative approach as well, where you're looking at numbers, right, which supports your analysis. Statistics that discover relationships or cause and effect situations. Also, it's going to help you figure out what primary sources you're going to use, maybe what secondary sources you're going to use, and maybe you're going to emphasize primary sources over secondary sources. So let's look at a couple of examples of focused and unfocused questions. Here's an unfocused one. How did the Industrial Revolution change society? Pause the video, maybe take a couple of notes or just kind of think, and then I'll give you my thoughts. So this is really not a very complex question. It's too simple. The concept of change, it's used too broadly. There's no specific aspect of society. Society's broad. Are you talking about women, children? Like, what are you talking about? There is a time period, the Industrial Revolution, but that's too broad. And the thing is, Industrial Revolution, there is no location. Countries industrialized at different periods of time around the world. So where are you talking about? So a more focused question would be, and I have to read this, to what extent did the shift from agricultural economies to industrial production in England between 1760 and 1830 change worker-owner relations? Now this is a better question, maybe not perfect, but it's more focused. We're kind of looking at economic transition among a number of things. It can be measured, right? To what extent? It's specific in the time and the place, and it focuses on a specific aspect of society, right? Workers and owners, and again, the concept of change looks at the change in the relationship between the workers and the owners. So here's another example of an unfocused question. Why are countries fighting over the South China Sea? Pause the video, give it a thought, maybe take a couple of notes. I'll give you my thoughts in a moment. So this is also a very simple question. The word why basically could lead to a list of reasons why different countries are arguing or conflicting over the South China Sea. No analysis. The word countries is quite vague. Now, South China Sea implies the countries that are around the South China Sea. It'd be better to be more specific. There's no time frame as well, so let's look at a focus question here. How have competing claims in the South China Sea contributed to conflict between bordering nations in the region since the 1970s? So this question clearly can be debatable. It can give perspectives, it can have analysis. There is a specific time since the 1970s and a place, the South China Sea. Again, we're not listing the countries though. There's a specific geopolitical aspect here, right? Claims. They're claiming this, they're claiming that. And there's a focus on the concept of conflict. It's a much better question. Okay, so let's formulate the question. So before you actually write your question, you're going to have to do a bit of a search to find out if this topic is actually good. Will you be able to find the sources that you're going to need to actually do a good job with your investigation? This is preliminary research. So basically, you want to start with a broad topic and then try to narrow it down. In the earlier example, Industrial Revolution down to worker-owner relations. Can you find quality resources for the investigation, both primary and secondary sources? Now, you want to connect it to your statement of inquiry if you're doing the MYP. So are the concepts and the terms, are they relatable? Do they relate? You don't need to use the exact same words, terms, concepts, etc. in the statement of inquiry, but they should relate. So how do you write a good RQ? First, it's got to be open-ended, nothing that can be answered with yes, no, or a specific fact. It's got to be a debatable question, which allows you to analyze, contest something, debate. There should be potential for multiple answers based on evidence. often starting with to what extent, how, should. It depends on how you frame the question. Basically, the answer should not be easy to find. It should be specific and it should be focused. One topic or one issue, one situation, one event, one time period, one person, group, or place. Here are some guiding questions that you can use as you develop your research question. I'm not going to read them right here. You read them for yourself, and if you can answer them, you should be okay. So here are some sample research questions that I think are fairly good. I'll kind of deconstruct the first one and then just read through the other ones. So, to what extent did the plague of the mid-1300s transform church authority in Europe? To what extent? That suggests I can measure it. A lot, a little, somewhere in between. The plague of the mid-1300s, well, I'm looking at the plague. And I'm looking at the plague in Europe. So Europe actually gives me my place. And the mid-1300s gives me my time. The word transform, well, it means change. So that's my concept. And then church authority. So basically my topic is, did the plague change church authority in some way in Europe in the mid-1300s? It's a pretty focused, specific question. Maybe not perfect, but it's pretty good. Should Christopher Columbus be viewed as a hero or oppressor? It can be debated. Was the French Revolution more influenced by Enlightenment ideas or economic hardship? Was it more of one or the other? You can debate that. To what extent did capitalism cause the revolutions in Europe in 1848? Was it capitalism or were there other factors? Should more Should more economically developed nations bear more responsibility for combating climate change than less economically developed nations? That can be debated. To what extent should government... look at that. So here are some sample research questions. They're all debatable. I'm going to deconstruct the first one and just read the others. So the first one. To what extent did the plague of the mid-1300s transform church authority in Europe? So the to what extent means I'm going to measure. To a great extent, to little extent, or somewhere in between. The plague of the mid-1300s in Europe, that gives me my time and my place. Because throughout history there have been many plagues. That gives me better focus. The word transform, well, a synonym is change, right? So that's my concept. And then church authority. That gives me even more focus, right? That gives me more of a scope. This is a pretty good question, actually, that's really going to guide my research. So other questions. Should Christopher Columbus be viewed as a hero or oppressor? Not a strong question, but it's also debatable. Was the French Revolution more influenced by Enlightenment ideas or economic hardship? To what extent did capitalism cause the revolutions in Europe in 1848? Should more economically developed countries bear more responsibility for combating climate change than less economically developed countries? And to what extent should governments prioritize security over individual freedoms during times of crisis? All of these questions cannot be answered with yes, no, right, or wrong. They are indeed debatable. So now let's get into justifying the question. This also takes some thought. So 2 MYP command terms come to mind as you're writing your justification for the question. Surprise, justify is one of them. And basically that means you're giving valid reasons and evidence for, that support your conclusion or your answer. That's for your investigation, but also for your research question. When you justify it, give reasons for what you think. And that means you're going to have to explain. Give details. Give details as to why this is a good research question. We'll show you how to do that in a minute. So why bother justifying the research question before you actually start your investigation? It gives you focus and direction for what you're about to do throughout the process. It also gives you an understanding of the significance of your question or your topic. Why is this important? If you don't understand that, why are you investigating it? It also helps you prepare the methodology, how you're going to do your research. We talked about that earlier. It also kind of clarifies the purpose. Why are you doing this? Why do you think this is important? Why do people need to know this? So getting a little bit clearer on what it means to justify, you're explaining why something is important, relevant, worth investigating, and feasible. Feasible meaning you can do it because you will have the source material to do it. So let's focus a little bit more on how to justify the research question. So when we look at relevance and significance, you should be able to explain or demonstrate why the topic is important, right? Why does this matter? You should be able to show how your research is going to add to knowledge that already exists. So think of it like you've read something in your textbook, but there's not really a lot of information there, but you're wondering more about the topic. You're going to dig deeper to add to that textbook, which means you're going to address a gap in that textbook. There might be a gap in the knowledge, and your research is going to fill that gap because you're so specific and focused. And ideally, your investigation responds to some kind of issue or debate or problem that might still be debated today. So critical thinking and argumentation are also important. So you should ensure that your question is specific and focused enough for a meaningful analysis and explain what that means. So you're going to have to explain that it addresses multiple perspectives or opinions or thoughts. Ideally, you're going to note some biases that might exist as you're doing research. Maybe it's your own, maybe biases from different cultural groups or perhaps countries. And you should be able to identify social, political, or economic contexts as you justify your question. And as you justify the research question, you're going to look at evaluating sources and evidence. This will help you determine what sources are relevant, so talk about that. Talk about what evidence will be analyzed, primary sources and secondary sources. You want to talk about how the evidence will be analyzed. I'm going to look at statistics and kind of compare these statistics over time to look for change, or I'm going to look at eyewitness accounts and testimony so that I can look at what people were saying and the different opinions and positions and experiences. Essentially, you're going to explain in your justification that yes, this can be researched effectively because you have the sources, the data, and you're thinking about the methodology, how you're going to do the research. And also, you're going to talk about the scope. You've determined that I'm going to talk about these facts because I'm very, very focused. I'm not going to be too broad. So very quickly put in a list. Identify the topic and the context. Identify the specifics, right? Give a narrow focus, the time, the place, the people, the events, that kind of thing. Identify the significance. Address why that issue, that topic, why it's important, and why it's probably even debated today. Explain the relevance. Connect your research question to the statement of inquiry in your unit, if you're doing the MYP, as well as the concepts. Connect it to the concepts. You don't have to use the same ones. Explain why this research is going deeper. It's going to add to the knowledge, for yourself, maybe for your class, your school, and the whole world in general. Make sure you identify different perspectives or potential perspectives and potential bias as well. And explain why this can be effectively researched. The sources are there, primary, secondary. I know I can do analysis because it's debated and I've got sources I can use to actually look at that debate. So after you've written your justification, ask yourself these questions and see if you can answer them. And if you can and answer them well, then maybe you have a pretty good justification for the research question. I'm not going to read these. Pause the video and do it for yourself. So let's look at a basic example here. So the statement of inquiry is new systems of production, consumption, and exchange of resources emerge hand in hand with economic, political, and social transformations globally. There's a lot there. So here's the research question. To what extent did the exploitation of child labor in factories lead to the introduction of social reforms in 19th century Britain? So how am I doing here? So the topic, child labor and social reforms. The focus, The impact of child labor exploitation on the development of social reforms. The concepts, I have change, causality, systems, justice. And again, the idea of lead to, basically that means change. The time is 19th century, the place is the United Kingdom, Britain, and the space that we're talking about is the factory system and industrial workspaces. Okay, so this is a chance to test yourself. You can go ahead and pause the video, and then looking at the right side, can you find these things in this paragraph? Topic, focus, time, place, space, relevance and concept, feasibility, can I do it or not, and the significance. Pause the video, try to identify these yourself, and then I'll show you in a moment. Okay, so look at the legend, the key on the right side, and did you identify those different things? Now, you could approach this in a few different ways, but this is one example of how you could do it. So that was a somewhat long video on how to write a research question and justify its relevance. Take your time when you do this, put the time into it. That will put you in control of doing a great investigation. Hope you liked the video. There's more on Instagram, Facebook, X, and on the web. Hope to see you again.